Hey everyone, welcome to another macro photography video. So today I want to talk about 3 tips to really help you improve your macro photography. And this video isn't necessarily for the really beginners if you've just gotten started, but if you've already kind of learned your way around macro photography a bit and have the equipment, then these tips will really help you take your macro photography to the next level. And even if you aren't necessarily going to photograph that much, you can still just follow along and see some of the photos I take. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is just being a little bit more aware of the background in your images. And this is an easy aspect to kind of forget about. You found a cool subject and you just want to frame it well and get a nice shot of it, and that's it. But the background is just as important an aspect of the photo. And the easiest thing, if you're using a flash, is you'll almost always have a black background in your image, because the flash exposes the foreground, exposes the subject, what's close to your lens, but of course the flash doesn't reach further away, so whatever's in the background is just isolated and it's dark because the flash is so much brighter than the surrounding ambient light. But one way you can change that is just by opening up the shutter speed. And I've got a good subject to show here, a moss, and I'll just take a test shot first, just with standard settings, so the maximum sync shutter speed of my camera with a flash, which is 1/250th of a second. And this is what that looks like. The background is pretty much black and it just doesn't look that interesting. But if I open up the shutter speed to, in this case, I think 1/30th of a second or so should work, then you can see there's a lot more ambient light in the background while the subject is still well exposed. And this just works because the flash is so much brighter than your ambient light that it's the only thing really exposing the foreground. And the flash is such a short duration that it doesn't really matter what your shutter speed is. Your subject and whatever's close to your lens will always be exposed the same. And that means that you can kind of think about the background as a separate exposure, where it's still affected by aperture and ISO, of course, but rather than the flash power being the main variable to adjust the exposure of your foreground, you can basically use the shutter speed however you want. So mostly I'll just keep it at 1/200, 1/250th of a second, but if I have something like this where the foreground and the subject is quite isolated from the background, I'll often just use a slower shutter speed of, I don't know, sometimes even just 1/100th of a second is enough, or even slower, and that way you have a bit more color in the background and it just looks a bit nicer. Just to show this effect again, I've found a really beautiful rose chafer beetle right here, and I'll take one shot, just standard at 1/200th of a second, like that, and there's quite a dark background, and then I'll open up to around 1/50th of a second, and you can see that's got an entirely different effect. And it's not necessarily that one is better than another, I'm just showing this as a way that you can have a little bit more control about the background. Another good technique for getting a little bit more control over your background is, maybe a bit more obvious than the other, is just placing something directly in the background. So I've got a little ladybug on the stick, and I'll take a shot just with kind of nothing whatever in the background, and you can see I've got a black background there. And then there's a dandelion here, so if I just move the subject, since I've got it on a stick like this, so that the dandelion is behind, and then take a shot like that, you can see that gives a much brighter yellow background. And I think in this case that looks quite a bit nicer. And generally I like doing this with flowers or whatever I have close in my environment to get a little bit more natural, but a bit more punchy, a bit brighter colors if I can move my subject around, if it's on a leaf or a stick. But you could also use something like background cards, so just printed pieces of paper that have colors on them and just place that behind, or some people use microfiber cloths, just a colorful cloth, and put that behind. And just by placing something close behind your subject, you can get a lot more colors in than you might otherwise have from something that's just sitting there on a stick. The second tip I want to talk about is actually just shooting a bit wider compositions rather than always shooting at the maximum magnification of your macro lens. Now, this can be quite tempting to just, since you have a high magnification lens, so why not just always shoot at the highest magnification, get the most close-up photos you can, get the most details as possible. And there's nothing wrong with these kind of photos, obviously. I mean, high magnification portraits can look really cool, and otherwise just textural detail shots and that kind of thing. But often it's worth just kind of taking a step back and including a little bit more of the scene in a slightly wider shot. And I like to do this, especially if I've got a subject in just framed nicely in a nice composition, whether it's on a leaf in a nice spot or in a flower or something like that, or if there's some kind of cool behavior that's shown, or just generally if it's a cool scene, or if I've got multiple individuals in the shot. And just generally being aware that you don't always have to shoot as close as you can, but sometimes it's better to shoot a little bit wider, and just be prepared to shoot like that sometimes. My third tip, and the last one for this video, is to focus a bit more on depth. Because it's very easy in macro photography to have your images end up looking quite flat, and that just leaves for a bit of an uninteresting and sometimes quite unnatural looking image. So to get some depth, often you want to just include clearly, obviously, a background element, but also something in the foreground closer to the lens than your subject. And that way you have a bit more of an isolated subject, and it just draws your eye into the subject a little bit nicer than if it's just directly subject and then background. So sometimes this can just mean going for a lower angle and being a bit flatter to the ground, or moving some other plants or flowers in front of your subject. And this is more difficult at higher magnifications, but generally just if you're able to get some objects in the foreground in front of your subject to get a bit more depth. And one way that it's particularly easy to kind of lose depth in your image is if you're focus stacking. And especially if you have a camera that can do bracketing or something, and that makes it easy to get deep focus stacks, it's very easy to basically overstack, to take too many images for your stack and to just get the entire subject or the entire image in focus. And in a lot of cases that just looks really flat. And if you have the whole front to back from the portrait, from the front of the face all the way to the back of the abdomen of a spider in focus, that just can create quite a flat and unnatural looking image. So often you want to be, when you're focus stacking, a bit more selective with how many pictures you use, and really only use the amount of images that you actually need for the actual area that you want to be in focus. So sometimes this is only a much smaller subset of the amount of images that you thought you would need in the first place. And often I'll actually still take more images than I think I need when I'm out in the field. I'll still shoot the entire subject front to back just in case, and sometimes I will use all those images, but that just allows me to be more selective in post. So I don't just always stack all of the pictures that I take. I'll kind of have a look through the pictures that I have and select the selection that I think actually really will add something to the image. And this way you just create a much more natural and I think much nicer looking image than if you just stack all the way through. Alright, so to sum it all up, I feel like all of three of these tips are kind of about just being more intentional when you shoot, and kind of building out a toolbox of techniques that you're ready to use whenever you find a subject, so that you can really think about the composition and the depth and the light and all of the aspects of the background and stuff, and really just use whatever technique you need to get the nicest image you can. And after you shoot like this for a while and are really intentional with it, a lot of these techniques just kind of become second nature, and you don't really think about which technique might give the nicest lighting or the nicest framing in this shot. You just kind of notice and you build an awareness for that kind of thing. So I hope this video helped a bit. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.